The air in the village was heavy today. It wasn't just the humidity of the rainy season, it was a weight that pressed down on our chests, making every breath feel like a chore. The mourners were gathered, their voices raised in a chorus of grief that sounded rehearsed, almost hollow. I stood at the edge of the grave, my eyes fixed on the mahogany casket. They say a funeral is a time for closure. But as I watched the red earth being shoveled onto the lid, the only thing I felt was a lie. My father was a pillar of this community, a man of integrity, or so we thought. But standing next to his grave, watching the way my mother held her handkerchief, I realized that I didn't actually know the man who had raised me. I was surrounded by people who loved him, yet I felt entirely, terrifyingly alone. I didn't notice the lawyer at first. He was just another suit in the crowd. But then I saw him. He was standing near the ancient baobab tree, clutching a leather portfolio as if his life depended on it. He wasn't crying. He wasn't even watching the coffin. His eyes were scanning the crowd, waiting for the perfect moment. When the final shovel of dirt hit the wood, he stepped forward. The silence that followed was sharp, sudden, and deeply uncomfortable. He didn't offer the family his condolences. He didn't even acknowledge the loss. He just stepped into the center of the clearing and opened his briefcase. The sound of the zipper breaking the silence was deafening. He pulled out a single, thick document, his hand steady, his face expressionless. My mother stood to my left, her posture as rigid as a statue, her eyes fixed on that paper. In that moment, the village fell into a silence so profound you could hear the wind whispering through the palm leaves miles away. The terms of the late chief's will, he began, his voice dry and devoid of any human empathy. The estate, the businesses, the accounts, and the entirety of the land are to be transferred to Mr. Chidi Okoro. The name hung in the air like a curse. I didn't know who Chidi Okoro was. Nobody in the village did. The shock didn't arrive as a scream, it arrived as a cold, paralyzing numbness that started in my fingertips and spread upward, stealing the air from my lungs. My mother's hand reached out, grabbing my forearm, not to comfort me, but to steady herself. Her nails dug into my skin, a sharp, physical reminder of the panic she was hiding behind her cold, porcelain mask. The community gasped. It was a ripple of sound that started at the front and traveled to the back, murmurs of confusion, indignation, and finally, accusation. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but my throat was closed tight. I turned to my mother, desperate for a look of confusion, a sign that she was just as shocked as I was. But she wasn't looking at me. She was staring past me, her eyes fixed on the entrance to the compound. That's when the iron gate creaked open. A man stepped through. He was dressed in a sharp, modern suit that looked completely out of place against the backdrop of our traditional funeral. He didn't walk like a visitor, he walked with the heavy, rhythmic, and commanding stride of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. As he reached the center of the clearing, the crowd parted for him. He didn't look at the casket. He looked directly at me. And in that moment, I knew that the life I had built, the life I thought I understood, was nothing more than a carefully constructed, elaborate lie. The silence in the compound became a physical weight. The stranger stopped 10 paces from the casket, his eyes unblinking. He didn't offer a polite bow to my mother, nor did he acknowledge the years of service my father gave to this community. He simply stood there, a tall, imposing silhouette against the backdrop of the setting sun. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a frantic need to protect what little remained of my father's honor. I took a step forward, my heels sinking into the soft, upturned earth. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. And what do you want with a family that has never heard your name? The man didn't respond immediately. He looked at me, then slowly shifted his gaze to the lawyer, who was still holding the legal document like a shield. A faint, cold smile touched the stranger's lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Your father, he said, his voice smooth and deliberate, had a life you were never meant to see. I am not here to take from you. I am here to collect what is already mine. I glanced back at my mother. I expected her to lash out, to call the security, to defend our inheritance. Instead, she had turned pale, her face drained of all color. She wasn't angry, she was terrified. She gripped my arm again, so hard that I winced, and pulled me back, forcing me to retreat. Let's go, she whispered, her voice trembling. We are leaving. Now. But the crowd was restless, buzzing with rumors. Some were whispering about the hidden debt, while others looked at the stranger with open suspicion. The lawyer stepped forward again, clearing his throat. Mr. Okoro has the legal right to inspect the property immediately, he announced to the room, his eyes refusing to meet mine. My mother didn't wait for another word. She turned on her heel and started walking toward our home, dragging me along in a daze. We were leaving the funeral, leaving the secrets, and walking straight into a trap I didn't yet understand. Once we were inside the house, my mother slammed the heavy mahogany door, locking the bolts one by one. The silence inside was even more stifling than the air outside. She paced the living room, her movements erratic, her breathing shallow. How do you know him? I shouted, the dam finally breaking. How did he have a legal claim to everything? She stopped pacing and turned to face me. The mask was gone. In its place was a look of raw, unadulterated fear. You don't understand the reach of your father's past, she said, her voice a fragile whisper. He made promises, long before you were born. Promises that were meant to be kept in the dark. But the darkness never stays buried forever. He told me if that man ever showed his face, we were to give him everything and leave. No questions asked. I stood there, stunned. My father, the man I revered, hadn't just built a legacy, he had built a monument to a secret life, and we were the collateral damage. The house felt different now. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, things that had been symbols of comfort, now looked like props in a play I didn't realize I was acting in. I waited until my mother had retreated to her room, the sound of her locked door echoing like a final gavel. I moved toward my father's private study. It was a room I had been forbidden to enter since childhood, a space that smelled of old parchment, pipe tobacco, and secrets. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The moonlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long, skeletal shadows across his desk. I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for the truth. I began pulling books from the shelves, checking behind frames, and running my hands along the mahogany paneling. My heart was thumping against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then, I felt it, a slight depression in the wood behind the baseboard. I pressed it, and a small, concealed drawer clicked open. Inside wasn't money or gold. It was a stack of journals, wrapped in a faded piece of Ankara cloth. I sat on the floor, the cold stone biting into my legs, and began to read. The first entry was dated 25 years ago. It spoke of a business partnership, not with a colleague, but with a man named Okoro. They had built their wealth together, but it was built on a foundation of shifting sand, a series of questionable deals that required a silent partner to hold the collateral. As I flipped through the pages, the handwriting changed. The confident, looping script of my father became erratic, strained, and panicked. He wasn't just building a business, he was running from a debt that was accumulating interest in the form of blood, betrayal, and broken promises. The room seemed to dissolve around me. I wasn't in the study anymore. I was back in time, standing in a dim, dusty warehouse on the outskirts of the city. I saw my father, younger, his face etched with a fear I never saw in him as an adult. He was arguing with someone, a silhouette in the dark, the man I now knew as Chidi. "I have a daughter now," my father pleaded, his voice breaking. "I cannot give you everything." But the man in the shadows didn't care about his daughter. He only cared about the leverage. He demanded a deed, not just to the company, but to the land, the house, and the future. My father signed it, his hand trembling so violently the ink blotted the page. He thought he was buying time. He thought he was protecting me. But all he was doing was creating a countdown. I didn't leave the study. I stayed there, curled on the floor, holding the journals until the first light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains, turning the room a sickly, pale gray. I heard the front door open, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of Chidi, returning to claim what he felt was his. I stood up, my legs stiff, my body trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, sharpening rage. I walked into the living room, the journals clutched to my chest like a weapon. My mother was already there, standing in the center of the room, looking small and fragile. Chidi stood across from her, his expression unreadable, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the space. I didn't wait for him to speak. I walked between them, placed the journals on the center table, and opened them to the page where my father had signed away our lives. "This is not an inheritance," I said, my voice echoing in the stillness. Chidi glanced at the journals, then back at me. For the first time, his mask slipped. He didn't see an inheritance, he saw the documentation of his own leverage. My mother began to sob, a sound that was raw and unfiltered, finally breaking the silence she had protected for decades. "I didn't know the extent of it," she whispered, looking at Chidi. "I only knew we were being watched." I watched them both, the man who had lived in the shadows of my father's greed, and the woman who had lived in the shadow of his secrets. I realized then that neither of them was my ally. They were two sides of the same coin, and I was the one who had finally decided to flip it. I took a deep breath, the air finally feeling clear in my lungs. "You can take the land," I said, looking Chidi dead in the eye, "and you can take the house. But you will never take the truth. I have already digitized these records and sent them to the village elders and the authorities." The color drained from Chidi's face. He knew that the moment these secrets became public, his legal claim would be investigated, audited, and destroyed. He turned, his confidence replaced by a frantic, stumbling retreat. As the door slammed behind him, the silence that returned was different. It wasn't heavy or suffocating anymore. It was quiet. My mother sat on the sofa, her face buried in her hands. I didn't go to comfort her. I walked to the window, watching the village wake up, the morning light hitting the red earth. I had lost everything, but for the first time, I finally owned my own life. I realized then that trust isn't something you inherit, it's something you build on the wreckage of what you've had to burn down.